Okay, so the MSU Research in Action series, if you are new, is really an attempt to connect K-12 educators with all the amazing research that's happening here at MSU in a really focused context. So to think about the incredible work that's being done, but also who these amazing researchers are, and think through how do we connect with their stories of the STEM researchers, and bring that into our curriculum and into our classrooms to create really meaningful experiences for our students. So if you wouldn't mind, we're going to start with a little getting to know you activity in the chat. So I'd love for you to tell us your name, the subject you're teaching currently this year or in the future, and a time when you realized you were meant to be a teacher.
Actually, could we just share this out loud? I mean,
Yeah,
there are only a couple of us.
Okay, hi. My name is Cara. So yeah, you were close. I just caught the tail end of that as I was logging in when you were saying my name, and I was like, oh, hi. So, okay, so I'm Cara. I'm in Great Falls. I'm actually the director of a STEM education program called Starbase. So we see every 5th grade student in the Great Falls School District and some outside schools. We also work with middle school and high school students and after school programs. We have another Starbase site in Helena, and a time when I realized I was meant to be a teacher. I was actually working in a virology lab at MSU with Mark Young's virology lab, so that was pretty cool. And I worked there for a couple of years as an undergraduate research assistant. And it was just so cool and such a great opportunity. And I realized that I really wanted to share that with students and give them, since I grew up in a rural community, I wanted to give them a leg up on how they can be successful in college and get through some of those general classes and be as successful as they can in pursuing their dreams. So.
That's so amazing to hear. I love that.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Latifat, and I teach chemistry and mathematics currently. So yeah, I realized I wanted to be a teacher in my second year during my undergraduate studies. At first, when I first entered the university, I didn't have the vibe, like I didn't have the motivation to be a teacher because I was just given the course to study. I wanted to study pharmacy or industrial chemistry, but I was given chemistry education. So at the point of 200 level, when I went for my student teacher practice, we do it every year. So during that period, I was saddled with the responsibility of teaching. Can you hear me? I think my network. Okay, you can hear me. Okay. So I was saddled with the responsibility of going into the classroom, seeing how teachers are doing what they do, and I was called to practice one day. So I'm like, wow, so you have this talent. So you have what it takes to be a teacher. Even when I'm very small, my stature looks small, but I can control my class and I can control my environment. So I think it was at that point I started having the interest of being a teacher. And currently, I love what I do currently as a teacher.
Thank you so much. I missed what grade you're teaching.
You say?
Which grade?
We call it in Nigeria here we call it SS1, 2, 3. That is from grade 9, 10, 11.
Okay, nice.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I guess I'm going to be telling you my entire story later. So I guess at this point in time, I'll just say I'm Bree, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you in a bit.
Great, thanks. And I'll answer just a little bit because I was a classroom teacher up until last December. And both my parents were high school teachers, and I fought it for the longest time because I saw how underappreciated they were. But I was in a PhD program for neuroscience, and I realized cells don't talk back to you and they're kind of boring. And so I realized I need a different career. and I fell into high school teaching and loved it. And I was like, why did it take me 8 years to fight this? So, thank you for all sharing a little bit about yourselves and your story. I apologize. My 2-year-old is demanding some attention right now, so I'm trying to get her to be quiet, but she's trying to capture the room right now. So let's move into the topic of the day, which really is the STEM sense of belonging. And so if you haven't really heard too much about sense of belonging before, it's really focused on whether students feel as though they fit within the STEM disciplines. And so it interacts, so student sense of belonging interacts with identity and with other factors that really makes them feel like they are part of the community within school and a larger STEM community. So yes, it's in your classroom, but it's also, there are layers of STEM sense of belonging. And it turns out that students with that higher sense of belonging are more likely to see a future for themselves within STEM. And then it overlaps with their motivation to complete high school coursework. So there's some really interesting things about STEM sense of belonging. We're going to talk a bit later more explicitly about what the research says about STEM sense of belonging, but I want us to explore it a little bit more first. So we are going to hear from Dr. Bree Cummins about her story in STEM and about her research. And with that, I'll let you take it away. I'll stop sharing my screen and you can chat with us.
Well, great. I guess what I will choose to do is tell you my story, and then I do have some slides for my research a little bit later on. As Jeannie mentioned, I'm in mathematics, but my road to getting to mathematics was kind of long. I started out when I was young, really enjoying math. In fact, I participated in the math counts competition in the 8th grade, and really loved it. But then I got to high school and I didn't like math anymore. And I don't completely know why that happened. I don't think I connected with the way that the subject was taught. And importantly for me, I didn't really have a personal relationship with my teachers. I didn't really feel emotionally supported by my teachers. One of them was a little distant and the other one was a little odd. And I just had trouble connecting. And for me, connection is really key. So I actually quit taking math partway through high school. I got my prerequisites done, and then I said, okay, I've had enough. And then I tried going to college for a year and switched to my major multiple times, tried a bunch of different humanities majors, basically, and realized I didn't know what I was doing. So I left for another 4 years or so and had interrupted undergraduate education. What caused me to go back was actually a volunteer opportunity. I really liked animals, and I had a friend of mine who said, well, it's a good idea to give back to the community. So I thought, well, okay, I'll go volunteer at the zoo. And the great thing about our zoo is that before they let you go feed the animals, you have to interact with the people and introduce them to the zoo and the purpose of the zoo. So we had like this 30-hour intensive biology course training over a weekend. And I loved it. And it was not only the subject material, although definitely it was part of that. It was just this feeling of being part of a community that was deeply interested in this intellectual topic. It was great. I loved it. So I went back to college the semester after I started volunteering to get a biology degree. And my very first semester, I was only qualified to take one biology course. So I looked around and tried to figure out what I would take, and I thought, oh, I have this math requirement. So I guess I'll get the math requirement out of the way. And I had to take pre-calculus, so trigonometry, which I had taken in high school, but it didn't stick. And I had just a wonderful teacher. a wonderful, wonderful teacher. I really connected with the material. She was super supportive. She said to me, you know what? You need to go take calculus with my husband in summer school. So I did that. I took calculus with him and I loved it. Again, very supportive teacher. And so I became a math major and got my double major in math and biology. And that's continued to this day where I work in mathematical biology. And during the course of my entire education, from undergraduate up through graduate school, up through postdoc, I have just had a string of wonderful mentors. So I've had great personal relationships with my teachers, but I also started doing research as soon as I went back into college. And my mentors they didn't just help me develop professionally, they helped me develop personally. I felt like they really cared about me as a human being too. And that was really critical, I think, to keeping me interested in what I was doing. And I would just briefly mention all of these mentors were men. I did not have the opportunity to have a female mentor, but they were kind of a diverse population. My undergraduate mentor identifies as gay. One of my postdoc mentors is Latino, and another mentor of mine grew up in a communist country. So they all have, kind of a broad perspective. And I can't honestly say what would have been different had I not had a diverse set of mentors. But it does make me wonder if it gave me the impression that STEM is a very inclusive place to be. So I think that may have had something to do with it. And as a research mentor myself, what I try to do is bring that idea of personal relationship into my interactions with students and let them know that I care about them as human beings and would like them to grow as human beings, and that is part of my job as a mentor. And I have not taught for a number of years now because I'm an assistant research professor, but I just accepted a tenure track position in the math department. And so I'll be getting back to the classroom this fall, and I'm pretty excited about that. All right, well, let me go ahead and go on to my research. So let's see. Is this showing up in full screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, as I mentioned, I do research in mathematical biology, and what I'm going to talk about today is how I work with time series in mathematical biology. So applied mathematics to me means that I use and develop mathematical techniques to model systems that are potentially important in real life, things that we need to understand or things that we need to predict in the future. And I focus on biological systems. Modeling in applied mathematics is particularly important if you can't directly observe a system, so you need to know how it's working internally. This can happen, for example, if you're interested in the inside of a cell. This can also happen when your system is extremely complex and you can't actually look at all of the parts at the same time. I've done a lot of research. I have a very large breadth in my research. And what I do basically is I look at dynamical systems, or those systems that evolve over time. And I look for features of those systems and try to understand and predict based on those features. The main applications, the main biological applications that I've been working on are genetic networks. So understanding the internal machinery of a cell, and epidemiology. So that's disease spread. And both of these things sort of overlap with dynamics and time series in a field that can roughly be called network science. So networks and graphs are basically nodes and edges. In fact, the thing here that's right in front of you, you could view as a kind of a graph. And so a lot of my work has to do with taking time series and models and representing those as graphs. And that's what I'll be talking about today. I'll start with a little bit of background. When I originally put this talk together, or part of this talk at any rate, I was planning on giving it to some middle school students for Science Olympiad, which unfortunately fell through because the school's canceled, which made me very sad. But I would be curious to know from your perspective as teachers, how accessible is this presentation for students of various ages? Because I don't actually know. and I would love to know for future opportunities to present. All right, so as a mathematician, I assume that there's some process that's evolving over time. And I don't know what this curve is. I just made it up. It could represent a whole bunch of things. It could maybe represent temperature over a number of days, or it could represent maybe the flow in a river over time, over some time period. So all I really assume is that some process like this exists, even though I maybe can't view it in the way that I'm doing right now. Now, if we have a process like that, or we suspect there's a process like that, all we can really do is measure it at discrete points in time at some sampling rate. And when we measure it, our sensors are also kind of noisy. So we're not even guaranteed to get measurements that are exactly aligned to the process itself. And myself as a researcher, all I get are those points. So I don't know what that underlying process is. I don't know how far away these points are from that process. And so my goal is to try to go backwards from these time series and figure out what the process actually is. And so that involves making a lot of choices and a lot of assumptions. So for example, one assumption that I might make is that every single time point is exactly true, that my sensor was infinitely precise, and it's really important that every single time point be part of my process exactly. So what's happening here is that I fit a high degree polynomial, a high enough degree that I could get it to go through every single one of these points. And now if I go ahead and just sort of put the original process over it, you can see that my fit has some really strong excursions away from the process. There are those really deep minima there that don't actually occur in the real process. So this is called overfitting. I have put way too much trust in the data. I made my model too complex, and I'm not really finding any truth. I won't be able to use this polynomial fit to predict out into the future. It's just too complicated. All right, so let's go the other way. What's the simplest model that I could come up with? Well, the simplest model is that, I mean, maybe this point cloud is just representing a line that has a lot of noise in it, that has a lot of variability in it. So the way that you figure out a line, a linear model, one way to do this is called linear regression. And you just take all of these vertical distances from every point to a line, you sum them all up, and you find the line that minimizes that sum. And so what I'm showing you here is the result of a linear regression of all of these time points. Now, I, as a researcher, am very suspicious of that point that's the second over from the right, the one that's really, really low. As a researcher, I'm likely to look at that point and say, well, that's a sensor malfunction. That wasn't really part of my process. I don't believe it. So in that case, what I might do is kick that point out, ignore it, and redo my linear regression, which is going to give me a line with a different slope. So there's no real reason a priori to think that one of those models is better than the other model. But if I try to extend those models out over time, you can see that there's a big difference. There starts to be a big difference in what they predict is going to be the future behavior of the system. So now, again, as a researcher, I can't know this, but this is potentially a problem with underfitting. I picked, my model is simply too simple in this case. So I'm looking for a happy medium. I'm looking for a Goldilocks solution. So one thing that I might choose to do is linear interpolation. And this is just where I take every pair of points and I draw a line between them. And if your noise isn't too bad, then this relatively simple description of the data is reasonable. It's kind of close to the process. However, it doesn't account for noise. It's still a curve that's going precisely through every point that was measured. And so in that sense, it's still not realistic in the sense that we know there's uncertainty in our measurements. So one way that you can think about that uncertainty is sort of like a noise band around your linear interpolation. So in this particular case, a noise band is just the linear interpolation itself raised up by some amount, and then also subtracted by some amount. And the thought is that if you pick the correct noise level, your true process is going to be inside of those uncertainty bounds. All right, so now let's go on to what I and my collaborators have actually done. So let's go back to this idea of trusting the data. What am I going to choose to trust? Well, what I'm going to choose to trust are the extrema of the time series. That is the maxima and the minima of the time series. But I'm only going to trust them up to some level of noise, which I can specify. So that's sort of a free parameter. It's a modeling choice. So we have a result that says if you pick a noise band, and if you do a computation that I'll describe in the next couple of slides, then if you wiggle your linear interpolation around and perturb it, and that perturbation is inside of your noise bands, then you're guaranteed to have some close extrema. They have to happen. Now, what do I mean by close? Well, let's suppose I stick a noise band on, and you can see that this noise band is pretty skinny. I'm assuming that the linear interpolation is pretty close. We have a way of computing these magenta bars that you see right here. And if you, one of them for each minimum, you can also do the maxima, but I'm just going to talk about the minima. And then if you take that magenta bar and project it down onto the time axis, this gives a time interval. And that time interval represents the uncertainty in which that extremum could have occurred. So if you took a little perturbation inside of this noise band, then what we proved is that any such perturbation has to have at least one minimum somewhere in here. I couldn't tell you exactly where, but it has to exist. So these intervals are a function of noise. So this is what happens when you start to increase the noise level. These time intervals get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually they overlap. And once they overlap, you lose the guarantee that you have to have a minimum. So if we go back here into the movie, we're guaranteed to have three minima in any perturbation in this noise band. We've got one here, and we've got one here in this interval, and we've got one down here in this interval. But if we go later in the movie, we're only guaranteed to have two. We're guaranteed to have one in this little interval right here and this little interval down here, but this minimum is shallow enough that it's died now. It's effectively, it's considered part of the noise in the measurement. So that can be particularly important if you have like a super hairy, noisy time series with a lot of jitter in it, because this procedure will allow you to drop out the little tiny minima. So that's for a single time series. That's just the important information for one. But the real research questions occur with multiple time series. So if I'm measuring multiple things, then what I want to ask is, could there be a relationship between these processes? Could one be causing another? And so the things that I have here, again, I made up all these curves, so I don't know what they are. So it could be like flow in a river. It could be solar incidence over a number of days, could be snowpack, all of these things that might be related, but I don't know for sure, and I don't know in what way necessarily. So what I'm going to do is this procedure that I described earlier for every single one of these time series. I'm going to find all of the maxima and minima, and I'm going to assign them time intervals. And then I'm going to look at the relationships between the time intervals. And then I'm going to make this lovely graph over here on the right. So over on the right, I have all of the extrema listed. So all of them are nodes in this graph over here, another name for which is called a partial order. The reason that it's called an order is because you can see that all of the arrows are going in the same direction. You could say that one thing occurs before another thing occurs before another thing, and so on and so forth. It's called partial because you can't say that for all of them. You can't stick them in a line. Some of them cannot be compared to each other. That happens when their time intervals are overlapping. So let's go back over here to the left, and I'm going to put some time intervals on the first 4 extrema that are in these time series. So if you look at that red first maximum, and you look at the next 3 time intervals, that first red maximum does not overlap. So it occurs first. It occurs before all of those other 3. But those other 3 all overlap with each other. So I end up getting these 3 arrows over here on the right, which show that the first red maximum occurs before these 3 extrema. But because there are no arrows between these 3 extrema, they could occur in any order. So for the noise level that I picked, this order between these are indeterminate. And any order I put there, any order at all, is consistent with these time series at this noise level. So now I have this nice structure. Any model that I can make that produces a structure like this can be matched. So I can say, let me construct a model, take that model output, see if it matches the data. If it matches the data, then I can't exclude that model as a possible description of how the processes interact. So for example, this graph that's down here on the left, suppose that the 3 things that I was measuring before were gene expression inside of a cell. And I hypothesize that cyan and red are affecting each other. Red affects blue, blue affects cyan, and red affects itself. So we have a model that will actually produce a graph like this, or actually a collection of graphs like this. And we can check and see, is it possible to make a graph like this from this network over here? And if it is, we can say, oh, this collection of causal relationships is possibly the underlying process for this system. And here I mentioned discrete dynamics in my very first slide. This is where discrete dynamics starts to interact with time series to give us sort of a network science approach. Thank you very much for listening to my talk.
That is so fascinating. And as you were starting to talk about the different curves, I had all these moments of, oh, it could be this, it could be that, and you were saying all of them. So that was amazing. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Now, how do I quit sharing? I don't see the stop share button. Oh, wait, there we go. Found it. Okay.
Before we move into the rest of the talk, does anybody have any questions?
Sure, since it feels like I'm in a tutoring session anyway. So honestly, thank you for your office hours today. So I got to admit, you lost me on how we got from where you showed multiple timelines, and then went to that graph where you showed the max one, and then the min, the max. Then you said those could be in any order, and I'm like, why though? Like, so you lost me there, and maybe that's like a whole thing.
Yeah, so let me see if I can answer without my slide, and then if we need to go back to the slide, I'll reshare.
Okay.
So those time intervals, what we're saying about the time interval assigned to an extremum is that the extremum could occur anywhere in there, in that time interval. I don't know exactly where it falls. So that means if I have two time intervals that are overlapping, well, they could, like, the top one could happen first, or they could swap. Like in that little area where they overlap, they could occur in either order.
Okay.
Because there's this uncertainty in the timing. So really that lack of order has to do with the fact that there's uncertain timing and your timing overlaps.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I think I get it now. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I had an oh moment. So thank you.
Okay, actually, I do not have any question currently because everything looks like you're doing the magic, and I try to understand. So probably when I get the slide, I would go through it at my own time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. And I think that conversation, what I was hearing, really spoke to the way that we tend to present our data. I know in chemistry, and I feel like in biology as well, we do a lot. If we're going to do standard deviation, the bars tend to go vertically. And so I know as a student, I understood that there was uncertainty in my y variable, but I tended not to realize that there's uncertainty in the x-axis as well. And so having that conversation about the time series and about how that time bar, if I'm using the words correctly, represents an uncertainty in that variable, I think it starts having a really beautiful conversation that we sometimes forget to have with our students, which is there's an x and a y axis and we need to consider uncertainty in both, right? So I know for me, I think of a classical graph where I'm looking to see if the standard deviation lines overlap in the vertical on the y-axis, right? But I don't really think about it in the x-axis, and it could be that I'm thinking about categorical data versus continuous data, but that's something to be a conversation to be having with students. So I valued that. Thank you. I liked that.
Thank you.
So let me go ahead and share my screen again.
Could I ask real quick, how, like, what level of student, if any, would that talk be accessible to, or parts of that talk be accessible to?
So I'd be interested to hear your input on this too. And I'm pointing, you guys don't know who I'm pointing to, but yeah. I took some notes because it was like, oh, an assignment. So I took some notes for you. And so I'll just kind of go through it. I thought, and I haven't been in a math class in so long. And so there's part of me that's like, some of these terms the kids might be familiar with, but some of them might need a reminder, like just even what it means to be discrete in math. Because I had to Google that because I don't use that in what I do every day. I don't talk about discrete at all. And then you talked about polynomial fit too. And I was like, polynomial, because I haven't talked about that in a really long time either. So if we were thinking about like middle schoolers, I think it would be good to just touch on this is what that means real quick. And then I appreciated that you said, this graph could be anything, like at the very beginning. And you said it could be temperature over time. It could be the flow of a river over time. And then having that moment to kind of think about, oh yeah, what could this be? Because I was thinking about like honeybee hive dynamics and if that would fit in there and stuff like that. So it was kind of fun to think about that. But then I thought, it might be helpful though if after you kind of have that, this could be anything, but then have like an example to kind of fall on as you go through, just to keep the interest going. So like if you're following like a, one of those things or a population or something to apply it to. And then I loved how you described how a linear regression works. That's the most clear I've ever heard it described in my life.
Oh, cool.
So, yes, that was the most concise and like the most, oh, wow, that's maybe the first time that really actually made sense to me, like that fast, and just reviewing it. So thank you. I wish I had had that a long time ago. So, and then and I already asked you about the part where you kind of lost me. But then it made a lot of sense after we talked about it just now. So I guess I would say like, I think high schoolers would be able to get onto this pretty easily. And especially if they're like taking, I used to teach AP biology in high school. And so there's definitely some things where you could apply this to some of the concepts that they're learning in that class. And then I think for middle school, I think at that level, it really helps to give them just an example to use it with, to think about, and then reminding them along the way, this could be anything though. This could be all of these things, but we're just going to follow this story so that they have kind of a story in their brain to apply it to and keep their interest. That's my opinion, and I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you for the awesome feedback. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. That was fun. So I enjoyed it.
That was really beneficial. Cara, you kind of already jumped ahead to like what our last activity was. So I love it. That's perfect because it was like, how do we make these connections? Latifah, let me know if you would, if you want to jump in and share. Otherwise, I can jump in with some suggestions. But I certainly don't want to jump in before you all get a chance to debrief and brainstorm and think.
Is there any way we can send Latifah like the presentation so she can look at it? Because did I hear that right, that she couldn't see it?
Oh,
Yes, I would love to have the presentation slides so I can go through it at my end here. Because I'm new to all this, that's why. So it's kind of very hard for me to just catch on and grab what you're saying.
Right. In the moment, we totally understand. So we'll make sure we get that to you to debrief in the future too. Thank you, Cara.
All right, thank you.
I will send you those slides after this, Jeannie.
Great. Yep. Awesome. So I'm going to put a couple things into the chat right now, and there are two links. The first is, and I'm sure probably Cara is familiar with this, but I'm not sure about everybody on the call. So Montana has adopted the next generation science standards with some changes. But one of the things that is like kind of overarching is that with the newer science standards, it's three-dimensional, meaning there is disciplinary core ideas, which is our traditional thought about what content we cover in science. But there's also cross-cutting concepts, which are themes that are woven through all science, actually really science, engineering, mathematics, all of the above. They're very similar to the mathematic practices that are in K-12 mathematics as well. And then the science and engineering practices, like I was mentioning, overlap with some of those math practices. So if you click on either of those two links, you'll actually see, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but you'll see that there is a K-12 grade band specific description of what students need to know in terms of using mathematics and computational thinking. And I am always really amazed by the depth that is expected of students at middle school and high school. I think that it goes beyond what we maybe were taught ourselves in high school and middle school. And so it's really interesting. I mean, looking at middle school, using digital tools to analyze very large data sets for patterns and trends. Well, that suggests that our students maybe need to understand how we could get to some of those curves through large data sets, right? So as you were speaking, I was like, oh man, I could see giving these students some data and having them come to the curves themselves in some way, or walking them through the data in this way, right? So now we're starting to think, okay, this is a 6 to 8 level. It's not even high school. If you move over to high school, it is a little bit more complex. We're starting to think about algorithms when we're thinking about making sense of the models. And so really bringing in that data to determine whether the model makes sense. So I could see how you create the network and start to use specific cases to really identify whether that model fits for whatever scientific phenomena you're using. But I certainly see where this is relevant to anything 6 to 12. A little earlier than that might be hard. I'm not sure if we're quite getting there in 3 to 5, but certainly 6 to 8, I think that this is like a valid direction we should be going. They might need a little bit more scaffolding at the 6 to 8 level. Like Cara was mentioning, the words minimum and maximum might not have been in a 6 to 8th grade math class yet, but I don't think that it's unreasonable to be able to support it. So that was really fascinating for me. The minute you started speaking, I was like, oh my gosh, I can think about how that practice could be tied in now to so many biological phenomena that we use in our classes. And sometimes that's a struggle for us life science teachers is, well, how do I bring in the mathematics to my life science class? And this is definitely one way that I could see looking at that from sort of a modeling perspective and thinking through the mathematics. So thank you for that very much. I did want to, so I'm going to skip through the Jamboard. We typically do it as a Jamboard, but first of all, it's a small group, so I don't think we need to capture it that way. But I would love to think through what could we do based on Dr. Cummins's work or your story in STEM. How could we use that to create a sense of belonging for students? So listening to the story, what do you think about supporting the sense of belonging for students in your classroom?
Are you talking to me or are you talking to the other folks?
To anybody. I mean, you can feel free to answer. It was more directed at Cara and Latifat, but I would love to hear if you have a thought.
No, I don't have anything to say. I just thought maybe you were waiting for me to talk. So
one thing that we do at Starbase with our students is depending on what the activity we're doing, we call them scientists or we call them engineers or chemists or just whatever they happen to be doing. And so that's one way we try to cultivate a sense of them considering themselves in a different profession or in something that maybe they haven't traditionally thought they were good at. I am one of those people who was like, I don't like math. I'm not good at math. But this actually made me think like maybe I could have been good at math, but which is nice. And I think somehow you managed to cultivate that sense of belonging in me just in this talk. But that's one thing that we do. And then I guess I was thinking about in Starbase, we have a canned curriculum that every Starbase has to follow. And then we're able to create lesson plans and then get them approved so everybody else can follow them. So through these series, that's what I'm hoping to get more ideas for, is like relevant ways to be able to bring current research, current practices into what our curriculum already is. And so I think it's just in thinking about math in this different way, like you were talking about earlier, and then being able to look at some of the data that we already collect in some of our activities, and then being able to just take it one step further about this is how it's used in practice, you know. I hope that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. And positioning our students as doers of math and science is so important, because that does make them feel as though they fit in that community, because they are the mathematician, they are the engineer, they are the scientist. And it is a subtle change in our language as instructors, but it's a big change in their experience as students. So thank you for mentioning that. I think that's a really great point. And you can start to see how sense of belonging fits is tied in so much with identity, because if you feel as though you belong, it's going to help you start to identify as scientists and engineers and mathematicians. So what the research suggests, so this is an example of how people have monitored students' sense of belonging. And the reason I wanted to bring it up is that these are quick checks that you can do multiple times throughout the semester. So starting out the semester by checking to see, do my students feel like they're a part of this community? Do I need, like, in what ways do I need to make sure that I'm developing a community of learners that will make sure we're all feeling as though we're included? Is there, am I seeing a pattern where students are maybe starting out reporting that they feel a sense of belonging, and then it's slowly changing over time? I like these questions up at the top about campus community. Sometimes, and almost every teacher I know has this anecdotal piece of data where they're like, I had this one really challenging student, and once I understood what they enjoyed about the rest of campus and I brought that into the classroom, they started to enjoy my classroom differently, right? We all had that one learner that we were able to capture by connecting with something else outside of our classroom, right? So if you make that connection and then bring them in, right? And then make them feel as though they then fit in. And then you really focus on that idea of relationship building, both from peer to peer and student to teacher. Dr. Cummins, you were saying at the very beginning that it was your pre-calculus instructor that kind of like encouraged you and it helped you feel as though you fit in and encouraged you to keep going, right? So there's an opportunity for you to create that dynamic between student and teacher, but there's also with peer to peer. Sometimes some students might connect with the teacher first and then start to explore relationships with peers. Other students, it's the opposite. They want that peer-to-peer connection first before they can start to feel comfortable opening up and being a little bit more vulnerable and maybe talking to the teacher. So thinking about, how do I promote students feeling like they fit in my classroom? I need to be thinking about, how do I build relationships between myself and the students, and how do I build relationships among the students? So thank you all so much. I think we're actually a little bit early for the first time ever, which is pretty amazing. So I'll definitely stick around. I'm going to go ahead and turn off I'll stop sharing and turn off the recording.